Hello and welcome to Hopeful Consciousness, and it's day 13 of my 2-week challenge, almost there, to help you have a spiritual and awakened moment. So today I thought I'd talk about something I've mentioned briefly before, but I've seen a few videos about this lately, and I came across something following on from just a chat with a lady who's almost like a psychic sort of spiritual healer, following Ryan's event, who'd done some work with a friend of mine and really helped her. And she recommended I go and watch this YouTube video, The Physics of Spirituality. Again, it features the guy that owns Mindvalley, the sort of training company, and this time he's interviewing Nassim Haramein, and yeah, it's just really confirmed everything that I was hearing that's possible on a spiritual and sort of energetic level in physics. And I know it's sad that we actually need that confirmation and can't just take things at face value these days, but that is unfortunately a little bit of the nature of the Western world, that we demand proof for absolutely everything now. So yeah, where to begin really? So he starts by talking about really the kind of makeup and the fabric of the universe. So going down to what we're made of. So we are made of about 130 trillion, that's a huge number, cells. And then inside each of these cells, we've got about 130 trillion atoms. So the sheer volume of microscopically minuscule things that we're made up from is simply amazing. And these cells are constantly regenerating all the time. So you are, over the course of about 3 years of your life, you've literally your body's replaced every part of the workings of you, really. Other parts of your body replace so much faster, in days or weeks, but it's a really interesting concept. And he goes on to talk about something I mentioned before, protons. So, as we've said, atoms are kind of made up of what scientists mostly thought was empty space, with these little protons circling around in these kind of wave function fields, and things like that. Energy, basically. He's actually doing the mathematics and the physical research, and then experiments to prove his theory about everything being connected. And I've mentioned things about the holographic nature of the universe before. So what he's finding is, in the same way I've talked about particles being entangled together, that absolutely everything is entangled, and even time is entangled, which is a really crazy concept. So he looks into the individual sort of protons. He says, if you can imagine that inside every particle is basically a holographic image and all the information of the entire universe. And this is how the universe is sort of created. So if you can almost imagine there's like a micro wormhole network connecting every single particle to every other particle in the universe. It's creating this sort of complex web and network. And it turns out that the energy inside the atoms is almost a bit like a plasma, which, as you get to look at some of the latest findings for how the solar system was formed, they talk about the electric nature of the universe in terms of plasma, rather than the gravitational theory of planets just catching each other. So I know this sounds a little bit far out there. You may not have heard of much of this stuff, but it's right up there on the cutting edge, literally not fairly new stuff. So if you can imagine, everything in the universe is contained within the smallest part of the universe, which goes into a lot of the Hermetical books like the Kabbalion, where it talks as above, so below, that basically what we see in the outside world is just a reflection of what's within. and the whole way that the kind of solar system is structured is very similar to the way the atom is structured, and things like that. And he goes on to talk about space-time, but more specifically space memory. So here's a really interesting concept as well. What is time? So it's knowing that you've gone from one point to another point. For example, say you put an ice cube on your plate. You know that that cube is going to slowly melt and turn into water. If you had no memory, absolutely zero memory, so you couldn't remember 1 second to the next, you have no experience of time. You just are aware in the present moment, oh, there's an ice cube, oh, there's a puddle of water. You know, the memory is fundamental to how it all works. So he's actually looked at some of Einstein's stuff, and he's kind of broken it down apart a little bit. And while E equals mc squared sounds amazing, it doesn't actually help very much, because the fundamental parts of the equation, we don't know how they work. So you've got E, energy, equals mass times the speed of light squared. But the problem is, we don't know what mass is. We thought that's physical stuff, but it's turning out to be more energetic. The speed of light, we don't know why it's set at that speed. It's a bit strange. If you can imagine as well, you might think that we're stationary in the universe, but you've got to imagine we're on a ball that's a green and blue ball that's spinning around on its axis, that's then spinning around in the solar system, that's then traveling as part of our kind of galactic cluster, that's then part of a super cluster. And what he's sort of surmised is by the end of it, you see that we're actually traveling probably throughout the universe relative to something in the universe at the speed of light. And that's the possible reason as to why that is a figure and a constant. So I know this is all very theoretical, but what his equations and mathematics are pointing to is that because every particle contains the information of everything else in the universe, it's such densely packed energy that a square centimetre of like space-time, as you might imagine it, is teeming with so much energy, and that's what kind of powers this whole conscious universe in a way. And Einstein talked about it as well, and you've probably heard it on sci-fi shows about 0-point energy and tapping into basically this field that's underlying the entire structure of everything as a power source. And just to give you an example, that 1 centimetre sort of cube of space-time, space memory, the amount of energy that's contained within that is enough to power the human race for 1 million years. We're talking orders of magnitude above anything you possibly imagine. And then it goes on to talk about how the universe is kind of structured. So if you want to travel from point A to point B, as we talked about, you can do it in the physical world, but that has limits the speed of light. And as we're finding out with all the quantum entanglement side of things, and it's been done on larger objects now, so things like a diamond, you can shoot a laser at a diamond that's entangled with a diamond on the other side of the planet, and the diamond over here starts to heat up because the laser's hitting it. The diamond on the other side of the planet starts to heat up. He talks about it's almost like you tickle a particle over here and it starts laughing over there, and it's simultaneously happening. So it's the information is, we've got a concept that you have to transmit that information, but what he's saying is the structure of the universe, because it's contained within every particle, there's a feedback loop that's part of this structure of the particles, that basically you make a change in one particle and the whole universe is instantly updated, because everything is contained within everything. So our concept of, if I make a change here, there's a delay and a lag, that's from very limited sort of Newtonian physics and not what's turning out to be reality. So when you get into that sort of side of things, you start getting into things like wormhole travel possible, and even things like teleportation, and other things. So what he then talks about is this information is, and the memory of space is sort of stored in the fabric of space-time, so, or space memory as he calls it. So you imagine we're on the planet zooming through the cosmos, and we're leaving this trail of memories of our experiences, and everything's experience is different from everything else. It's all got a different perspective of it, and that's being left in the underlying fabric of space-time. And we've already seen, and his work has sort of shown, that consciousness is not contained within here. There is no evidence, no scientific evidence, that consciousness is contained within here. There's been people with massive brain damage, you know, missing most of their brain, still fully awake and conscious. It's more like our whole structure, as I've talked about before, is set up as this like antenna system to feed off this kind of universal field and receive the signal. So what it turns out is that signal's updated in something called Planck time, which is the smallest possible unit of time. So it's just given that name, but it's imagining like a TV screen, like when you're filming with your video camera. Like I'm filming this at 60 frames a second, 4K. You can film at 30 frames a second, and that's enough to fool your eye into thinking it's a moving image. So when you start wanting to move from point A to point B here, it's basically what's happening is a bit like your cells in your body. You're literally deconstructed and reconstructed one Planck moment later, deconstructed and reconstructed, you know, and it's so fast we could never even observe it or even hope to observe it. So then you get into the idea of, right, so if I'm constantly being, you know, recreated and discombobulated sort of thing, and recreated in such a rapid fashion, why is it that if I have a like tumour on my left kidney, for example, I can't imagine that the new version of me has not got a tumour on my left kidney when it rebroadcasts one Planck sort of time unit later? And the answer is you can, and that's what I've talked about. And 30% of the population do that, and that is the placebo effect in action. You are rebroadcasting your holographic image of yourself without any problems, without that tumour on your left kidney, for example. And then you get into other aspects of, well, now I can broadcast myself instead of being here. I'll just broadcast myself to reappear here. I've talked about this in one of my earlier videos. But he really delves into the physics of spirituality, and he goes through all these concepts that tie in with all these ancient texts. So really do highly recommend checking out that video. It's about an hour long. He's got some other follow-up interviews as well, which are equally very good, but this one's really concise about consciousness. And there's a distinct difference between we think a lot of the time that our consciousness is separate to us. The whole universe is consciousness, and as it turns out, as he was talking about with time is in itself kind of malleable in a way. So there's no limit on time in terms of things can go back and correct themselves. And I mentioned that in one of Joe Dispenza's works. He mentions it in his book about people can meditate now. So I could get a group of people here, say 1,000 people. We do a group meditation for healing to heal one hospital's worth of patients 2 years from now. Nothing else happens in between now and then we statistically measure that hospital's patients 2 years from now, and at that point that we focus the meditation on, so we're broadcasting into the future, that hospital will receive a drop in its kind of issues and things like that, and patients will recover faster than normal. That's been proved over and over again in experiments. And the fact that consciousness is reality and it affects every part of reality. You may not have heard about this thing about random number generators as well. Your mind, your consciousness can affect a random number generator from a computer, and it doesn't have to be like a spiritual yogi's monk's mind, just a normal person's mind. You can sit them in a room, get them to focus on, I want you to make the random number generator flip out a 1 more often than a 0, and that'll happen. And they've even done it with experiments with animals as well. So this is a amazing experiment. So say you get a little square arena, you've got a little toy buggy that kind of goes around the arena in a random fashion, completely randomized. Computer tells it where to go using a random number generator. As you would expect, with nothing else there, the little robot thing goes around completely random. Now what you do, the second experiment, you get a set of young chicks that bond to that robot as if it's their mother. So you kind of introduce that robot just as they're growing up, and then you put that same arena down, but this time you put the chicks to one side. So as the robot moves away, they're calling for its mother to come back, and just the conscious effect of those chicks calling for their mother to come back influences the pattern of movement of that robot to the extent it favors the side where the chicks are in more often than not. That's just amazing. That's not humans doing it. This is just, yeah, like a chickling, sort of affecting the nature of reality and the consciousness. And it just shows you how we really are just scratching the surface of some of this stuff that people have talked about for years and years, and how these amazing things really can be possible, that everything in reality is generated by our consciousness, and it's our group experiences that are generating this reality. So when you start to understand that at a fundamental level, a lot of things can happen and a lot of things can change. And I'll leave you with that thought for my final video tomorrow. Look forward to seeing you there. Cheers. Bye bye.